Hey everybody, today is Monday, March 4th, 2024. Coming up on the show today, From Anyone But You, editor Tia Nolan.
I feel like when I edit a scene, or like I said, reading the script, I start to live in it. I get so familiar with the footage that I'm in there and I can anticipate how I want to cut something. And if Will has a note or if something isn't working, I know the footage backwards and forwards so I can problem solve.
And editor Kim Boritz.
When we're sitting with Will, he wants to reassess and look at every line read. So instead of being able to click on each individual clip and try and find exactly where that line is, ScriptSync really did help because we could just get through stuff so quickly and color 2 or 3 takes that Will liked and then play them again and then, narrow it down to that one and just swap it out. So that saved a lot of time.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Well, hi there. Good to see you. My name is Matt Fury, and this is another one of those podcast kind of deals. On this one, we talk mostly about editing. Assistant editing, sometimes sound designing, sometimes directing, every now and then advice to the lovelorn. Hey, speaking of love, what a wonderful topic to cover. Especially when you mix it with a little comedy. Because what you end up with is this thing they call a romantic comedy. Or RomCom if you're pressed for time. I will be the first to admit we very rarely talk about romantic comedies on the podcast. Not that we try to avoid them on purpose. I do like to think that this show is a fairly accurate representation of the predominant types of film and TV shows that are in the zeitgeist. So maybe they just don't make as many rom-coms as they used to. With the way things are trending in the world of cinema, you're just not going to get audiences out to the theater unless it's a superhero, sci-fi, or action blockbuster. Rom-coms are fading away at the box office and don't translate to foreign audiences. Or so one might think. Enter a little movie called Anyone But You. It's a rom-com starring Glen Powell and Sydney Sweeney as Ben and Bea. See, even their names are cute. It would seem that despite having an amazing first date, their initial attraction quickly turned sour. And wouldn't you just know it, they unexpectedly found themselves on the guest list for a destination wedding in Australia. So as to not ruin things for everybody else, the two pretend to be a perfect couple to keep up appearances. Sounds like a rom-com to me. And as we know, rom-coms don't work at the box office anymore. Except this one. With a budget of $25 million, it has made over $200 million worldwide. And I think at the time I actually recorded this interview, it was at $170 million. So it's just going and going. So much for the theory that rom-coms can't do well in theaters and definitely don't translate overseas. Clearly, somebody is going to see this movie. So right there is a great reason for us to explore this little picture. Another great reason is that one of the editors is Tia Nolan, who we had on the show a while back to talk about her work on Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. I remember at the time thinking that Tia was great to talk to, and I was definitely looking forward to the chance to do that again. Another great reason for covering this movie is that Tia is joined by her assistant-turned-co-editor Kim Boritz. And you know how much I love having new people on the show. But before we meet up with our old and new friends to talk all things rom-com, lend me your ears. Don't worry, I'll give them back. But I just have to tell you about a few things I think you need to know. Now, this first thing is a new thing, a one-time thing, so pay attention. Don't hit that skip button on me yet. Coming up this Sunday, as you probably know, we have the Oscars. Yes, very exciting. But the day before, Saturday, March 9th, is something I find even more exciting. And that is the ACE IAVA panel. IAVA stands for Invisible Art, Visible Artists. You know, editors. But not just any editors. These would be the 5 who are nominated this year for Oscars. Thelma Schoonmaker for Killers of the Flower Moon, Laurent Seneschal for Anatomy of a Fall, Kevin Tent for The Holdovers, Yorgos Mavrotsarides for Poor Things, and of course Jennifer Lame for Oppenheimer. Those 5 will be led in a discussion by editor Sabrina Plisco. And you don't want to miss this. Avid is sponsoring and carrying the event live. At least that is what they are telling me. I don't have a link for you yet, but follow Avid on social media and I am sure, yes quite sure, it will be posted there. So don't miss it. While we are on the subject of ways you can get more great post-production knowledge from such esteemed editors, did you know the Rough Cut is also available in blog form? Well, it is, over on blog.frame.io/theroughcut. Where not only is it transcribed, so yous can read it, but it is augmented with multimedia assets like behind-the-scenes pictures, Avid timelines, needle drop playlists, and cool videos that explore and detail concepts brought up on the show. You can even listen to the podcast with the embedded podcast player while you look at all those pretty pictures. For those of you with short attention spans who forgot the URL I already gave you, do not worry, there is a link to blog.frame.io/theroughcut in this episode's show notes. And here is one final note about how you can make sure your next film or TV show sounds epic and awesome. Unless that is not what you're going for and you want vibey and understated. Whichever kind of music you want, our sponsor Extreme Music has it for you and then some. For over 25 years, these pioneers of production audio have given film and TV makers top-shelf tracks from the biggest names in the world of producing and composing. There's that Dune guy, Hans Zimmer. And you got those Social Network guys, Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross. Even Snoop Dogg is over there. So what are you waiting for? Just search their immense catalog using metadata like tempo, genre, composer, instrumentation. And when it comes to instrumentation, they will give you options for that too. All of that power in one simple-to-use website where you can even do the licensing. And if licensing confuses you as much as it does me, you can just call Extreme Music. Their audio operators are standing by. So the next time you have a story to tell it with great production audio from Extreme Music. Okay, that was a lot of talking. Well, here's some more. We join this interview with Anyone But You editors Tia Nolan and Kim Boritz already in progress, as Kim is about to be attacked by a giant spider.
This is very random. Can we pause for a second? Because there is a giant spider in front of my laptop.
Okay.
And I need to kill it because it's like staring at me and it's terrifying.
That is huge.
I don't know where it came from, but I'm terrified. So let me kill it, please.
I'm scared 3,000 miles away.
It's
Just don't let the SPCA see this for me, or the American Humane Society.
I think we can all justify that your life was in danger and this action was warranted. So I thought we'd start off by talking about, as we often do, getting on the show. And Tia, I know you've worked with writer-director Will Gluck for a while now. Mm-hmm. Tell me about how you two met, the projects that you've worked on together, and how that all led to you getting the call for Anyone But You.
We started on Friends with Benefits, and I was kind of a late hire into that, so I sort of hit the ground running with him. I believe the project had gotten delayed and he'd lost his editor. There was some sort of a complication. So just jumped in with Will, and we kind of had the same sensibilities. So then I ended up he did a short-lived TV show after Friends with Benefits called The Michael J. Fox Show. So I did the pilot and one episode of that, then another pilot that he produced, and then we jumped into Annie. And then from there, this is our first feature together since then, because he did 2 Peter Rabbit movies, but they were all in Australia. So editor had to be Australian. It was all the tax breaks, that sort of thing. So it was really fun to be back together again.
Kim, this is your first project, I think. I'm often wrong, with Will, but you and Tia have worked together for a little while now. Tell me how you two met and the projects you've worked on since then and how that led to you getting the call for this film.
So it's funny, Tia and I actually have a tied history to the editor Richard Marks. So Richie actually got me into the industry as a PA, an editorial PA, when we were shooting How Do You Know in Philadelphia, where I'm originally from. And so it wasn't until I had worked with Debbie Berman, who is also a friend of Tia, that when Tia was looking for a first assistant for THUNDERFORCE, Debbie kind of introduced us. And it was actually funny, like for our interview, when we realized what the Richie connection was, because Tia had worked with Richie from pretty much the very beginning, right, Tia? Like
almost. We worked together. I think he was my mentor for like a decade plus. We worked on many projects together. I'd worked with a few other New York editors that sort of were the stepping stones to get to Richard Marks, the huge famous editor. And I definitely worked those connections to get to him. But yeah, then he really helped mold my career.
I often ask about references from the director, but in this case, the movie is loosely based on Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, and you have quotations from the play. They're embedded in the background as title cards and occasionally, work their way into dialogue, almost like Easter eggs. Do you read or reread Much Ado About Nothing, and were there other references that Will gave besides that?
I would say that for me, I didn't reread it beforehand, but there was definitely times where I don't know if Kim, you did this as well, but we would scramble to find what is the most appropriate quote. So I was speed reading Much Ado, a little speed read of Shakespeare during the process, which is not easy.
I think everyone speed reads Shakespeare, to be honest.
Yeah, I think Google was our best friend in that search as well.
Very true, which would get it wrong. A lot of times, like the little Google things or that little high school Shakespearean websites, whatever that is, would actually quote from the wrong thing. And so we'd put it in and then someone would be like, that's not from Much Ado, that's from, something else, Midsummer Night's Dream or whatever it is.
Once you read the script and agree to do the film, what do you do next to prep for it?
So when I work with Will, he just keeps sending me scripts. So we about, let's say, I think we started in the beginning of March. Kim and I were overlapping with another film for the same studio, so it's a little blurry as to when we started, when that ended, and this one began. But from about November, when Will and I started talking about it, on to the start of shooting, and then throughout shooting, he would send me a draft. Like, literally, it would drop every Friday night. So it was one of those things of like, yay, it's the weekend. Okay, now I have work to do. And then I think that I was able to bring Kim into the scripts when it got to the studio level, because Will was sort of treating me as the trusted family member for a while, just trying to get notes so that he could get it to the studio. So that was, my prep time, is just really living in the script with those characters, with him, and helping him with story, but also with like visual transitions. Or if I saw things that I just felt, we're never going to keep this, and you're going to really spend so much time shooting it, or this location, or whatever it is. So I guess that's really the prep up until just diving in.
Well, I think it was because we had like Nick come in, and we had to have him leave Harold for us to, because I was still kind of finishing Harold, so I felt like the first couple weeks was just a whirlwind of transitioning to Anyone But You.
That is true. So Nick Coker, who is our first assistant, so basically Kim had been working as my first, but also editing with me, really starting on THUNDERFORCE. And then we got brought in sort of late in the game to a film that hasn't been released yet. And because it was a late in the game thing, it was a hit the ground running, and Kim and I both tackled stuff. So Kim, one of her portions of that film was an animated sequence that went on long after the wrap of the film to get it honed in, because that's how animation goes. So Kim was really, for the first couple of months, back and forth trying to still work on that sequence. So yeah, she came in a bit later. But I think what we did was we had just the usual meetings with the Australians, and really there's a certain amount of difference in how they structure their post-production. So trying to just sort through that, get everything working in a way that, we knew we were getting everything that we needed. That's always the challenge when you're so far away and the time difference is so huge. So I guess that was mostly the prep for that.
And so, Kim, when you join, what are the things that you two hash out between each other in terms of how are you going to tackle this project?
I think in this case, it was definitely me following Tia's lead, since she kind of has an eye and worked for Will and knows what he likes. So Tia would definitely, say, hey, today I'm giving you this scene, and I would work on it. And there would always be a pass with her on notes and showing her my cuts and, polishing and all of that. And then we would send to Will. But, eventually our cutting, I think, became pretty seamless, where, I learned from the best. So I'm kind of like honored to be able to have Will not necessarily know like what scenes are mine or what scenes are hers initially, because they just work so well together.
Well, and in that regard, how do you balance that editorial workload?
Definitely on this one, it was as the footage was coming in, I think we'd look at a schedule a bit ahead of time, knowing what they were going to shoot the next day. There were certain sequences that I know I had spent a lot of time discussing with Will, so I knew like these are the things I have to have as, I'm going to take these sequences because he and I have been sorting it out. He's been giving me notes of how he's going to shoot things, and so I'm going to trust that he's going to want to talk with me directly, and I'll need to. I keep saying this, but it's living in something. I feel like when I edit a scene, or like I said, reading the script, I start to live in it. I get so familiar with the footage that I'm in there, and I can anticipate how I want to cut something. And if Will has a note, or if something isn't working, I know the footage backwards and forwards so I can problem solve. So there are certain sequences where I wanted to be really on top of it because I knew they were concerns for him. So then me kind of selfishly taking those on myself. But we would get footage in, and I would know like I'm bogged down with one of those sequences, but there's other scenes coming in, and Kim, can you take those? And sometimes those things were also very heavy hitting scenes. And so Kim would jump onto them. And then once Will was in the cutting room with us, it was great because I would just kick him into Kim's room and say, that's her scene, go work with her on it. Or she'd come into the room with us and then she would sit at the Avid and I would sit on the couch, which never happens, pretend to be a studio person or whatever. And I agree with Kim, it became seamless. And I saw this very early on THUNDERFORCE with Kim when I gave her a couple scenes. That was our first film together, but I gave her a couple scenes and had very minor notes on them. And like pretty instantly, she'd be able to turn around my notes and we would have a scene that felt like any other scene before or after it, which I think is really important when you do multiple editors because you can have different cutting styles.
So we should talk about some of the more practical aspects of the film, shot predominantly in Australia. And if it wasn't, great VFX work there. But I think it was shot in Australia. Where were you cutting?
We were in LA. So we started on the studio lot, on the Sony lot, because we were overlapping with the other. So we were literally like almost hands on two different systems at the time doing those two films. Really just finishing up the other. But then we moved to West Hollywood, where Will's company, Olive Bridge Entertainment, is, and worked in what ended up being a lovely space, but we were basically in the midst of West Hollywood on one of the busiest corners in what would be called a rustic industrial type of space. So if you think of those two words and also sound, it's really not conducive to good sound quality at all.
And how about the timeline? How long was the shoot? How long was post and any sort of reshoots that might have happened?
I think it was the end of February, early March until mid-April. So what is that, 2.5 months shoot, something like that. And then because of strikes and we did some additional photography, the film went longer than we had anticipated. So I believe we wrapped in the beginning of December. We were originally supposed to wrap before Thanksgiving, but there was some additional photography that was done. And so we were waiting out the strikes to get that in and then scrambling to get that into the theaters because we really shot and had, a month, maybe less before it was on screen.
Kim, are you able to watch the dailies together regardless of whether or not you may be cutting the scene for which they were shot? And do you and Tia have regular meetings anyway? Do you make a point of, no matter what we're doing, we're going to stop and connect with one another, review each other's cuts, talk about tone, anything like that to keep the movie so that it feels like it's one editor, one vision?
I wouldn't say that we were able to watch the dailies together because Will does shoot a lot and there was a lot of, multicam, sometimes 3 cameras going at once. So in terms of like the amount of footage, Tia would really have to kind of focus on the scenes that she was cutting and then I would have to kind of jump in and do the other scenes as well. But I would definitely make it a point to try and watch, as much as, the dailies on the footage that Tia was cutting and vice versa, just because you kind of have to know everything with Will, because he does, ask a lot of questions and he, remembers like a very specific thing in a take. So it's, important to just keep up on that. But definitely like Tia would bring me in after she cut a scene. And what's great about Tia is she would also bring like the rest of the crew. She's very much creative. Everyone should come in, everyone should sit, everyone should be familiar with the film and really be a part of the creative process. So we would definitely sit there and give notes back and forth and kind of run ideas of just the overall picture of where it's going in character arcs and that type of thing as well, because that's so important, especially while Will's shooting, to make sure that, it's really coming together while he's doing his thing too.
So Tia, you said that Will likes to ruin your weekends with his script updates in a good way, I'm sure. But once he's in production, is there a lot of interaction between the three of you?
Well, since Will hadn't worked with Kim yet during production for the initial shoot, the main shoot, it was just between he and I. So I do this thing on the films I work on where at the end of my workday or after I've watched dailies, depending on when I get the footage in, I will do a daily report every day. Some directors don't respond at all. Others do. They love it. But every day I'll say, here's what I watched. This is really working. You might want this, that, and the other thing, just to kind of let them know I've seen everything and ask some intention questions. With Will, He shoots a lot of footage, like Kim said. He often keeps the camera running and restarts. And he'll either do that for full takes, or as he gets into later takes, he'll restart for literally for line reads. And so it's just, I think on this particular one, we were getting on average, 6 to 8 hours of footage a day. I mean, it was really, that's happened in the past when I've worked with him. Certainly on Annie musical numbers, we sometimes had 11 hours of footage a day. And then it's like, that's my work day. How am I watching all of this? I will watch multiple cameras grouped together. Kim and I both will do that because you have to get through the footage. So I do have a constant communication with him, and, he will text or call me during work day to say, oh, we're about to do this. What do you need? I also make sure, and so Kim and I were both doing this, sending him scenes almost at the end of every day, just to say, here's what you've got. Because when a film is on location like that, and sometimes sometimes it's like, that's the day and we can't go back. But there was a scene fairly early on that was shot in an airplane, her trying to steal his cookie in the airplane. There were a lot of extras on that plane, including Glen Powell's parents, the woman who lifts up her sleep eye mask and kind of glances over as Sydney's straddling him is his mother. And the passenger asleep next to Glen is his father. So, we had kind of a complicated day, and certain inserts I think would have helped the comedy were missed. So I was able to discuss that and send Will a cut so that he could scramble to get an additional day on that airplane set, which was like an actual airplane, but in a museum somewhere. So it wasn't a functioning flying airplane, but yeah, they had to go and, make special arrangements to go back.
When the director is also a writer or one of the writers, do you notice any efficiencies that come from that in the cutting room?
I think the thing with Will being the writer as well is that he's good at rewriting a scene in the cutting room, as opposed to really holding on to things as if they're precious. I think also his background, he started out on half-hour comedies. So I think writer's rooms and just never being precious about your material, I think that has kind of added to that. So I think, Kim, I know you probably experienced this. In one of the bigger scenes that was very different early on that Kim cut was the scene where the dad, Dermot Mulroney, is trying to dive into the swimming pool. And Kim, you can speak to how that scene turned into what it is today, and actually based on a huge suggestion of yours.
Yes. What Tia is referring to is because the actors had such great chemistry from like the very beginning of the movie, the way Will had originally scripted that scene was that it was Glenn who would initially walk up and see Dermot there, and him giving him how to dive tips. But when we actually got the footage that day, it was both of them together. And so for that, it didn't necessarily make sense in the story at that point when we were looking at it as a whole, because they were still trying to figure out like whether or not they liked each other or didn't like each other. And so we initially ended up going back to Will's original idea and actually visual effect Sydney out of the whole beginning. So it really is just Glenn walking up by himself, observing, and then she kind of comes in and sees him being nice to her dad as opposed to her being there the entire time. So that, I think, really did help the story for that part.
The challenge for any film, any project, is pacing. And I think in rom-coms, it can be even less forgiving. They need to move. Therefore, you have to get a lot of story points in efficiently and coherently. They meet quickly. They fall for each other quickly. Due to those darn rom-com misunderstandings, they fall out of love even faster. And then they're thrown together by fate into an awkward situation. They have a destination wedding where everyone wants them to get along and not ruin the wedding. So you have lots to do there. You're setting the context, introducing lots of characters, leaving breadcrumbs for the story logic. Let's talk about crafting that setup and getting to the conceit of the film as efficiently as possible.
I think, very early on, there was a lot more with all the other family members. And even though it was very clear that it was it was Ben and Be's story, a Sydney Sweeney, Glen Powell starring rom-com, there was a lot of charming stuff with all the family members. So we had some early screenings. One of the things that Will always does, he comes in, he dissects everything. He gets to a place where he feels good with the cut, and this would be probably like a 3 or 4 week process. And then we put it up in front of friends and family once a week for at least another month or 2. Sometimes we would have more than that. We'd have people in the cutting room, and then we'd be in front of like 100 of our closest or nearest and dearest. So it was clear early on that too much family was taking away from the main conflict. And to Kim's point early on, Glen and Sydney had such great chemistry that having too much of all the family being kind of clocked at every point was taking away from the original conflict of like these two people hating each other, because it was just a lot of charming stuff. So that took us a bit of time to figure out, who do we lose and how do we make this? Because it wouldn't have functioned if it was just the Ben and Bea characters either, because you need to know that they're driving the other family members crazy and that this wedding is going to fall apart, and Bea has conflict with her parents and her decisions on her future. There's an ex-boyfriend and an ex-girlfriend. And when you took too much of that out, then also people didn't follow the plot. So it was a balancing act.
That diving scene that you had the note on and ultimately fixed, something as simple as a character observing something and then being part of the scene or already being part of the scene can add to or subtract from the likability of that character. And that's a big component of something like this. Without conflict, you don't have a movie. You have to find a way for the audience to like your characters through conflict. They have to be believable as much as they can. They're going to have flaws, but they still have to be redeemable. And regardless of what's in the script or in the dailies, you're the one that has to manage and massage it so that it works just right. So how is that aspect of cutting the film, making the leads likable and yet still believable as antagonists, and then can still come through that and fall in love again?
I think it's just finding those moments between the characters, because you have them hate each other for the majority of the movie. So you're like, okay, how are we actually going to create their chemistry or create that their love is believable at the end? So I think having, especially like the opening scene, and Tia can attest to this, but setting up their love at the very beginning in their meet cute, I think really helped the film, because initially we didn't have that. And so I think it was harder for audiences to believe that these two characters could fall in love just in one night. So having them spend time throughout the day and, the little nuances of the walking and talking and those kinds of build-ups emotionally for these characters, I think definitely helped.
And as far as those two leads go, the question of whose movie is this? Are you thinking about the audience being aligned with Ben or Bea? And are you careful to track how much time we're spending with each of them when they are separate from one another?
Yes, we found early on that, at least at the time, and the audiences we were having come in, Sydney Sweeney was definitely the better known actress. And RomCom. So audiences had a tendency to follow the female character more. And what Kim is sort of referencing, which is, we can speak to our additional photography in a moment, but early on we had plot stuff to explain her, but we didn't have a lot of emotional time with her alone. And so people did give us notes about, we think it's her story. It was never really his story, but as opposed to it being both their story, everyone was really set on following her, and as a result, they wanted more. And so we ultimately did 3 days of really ridiculous, very successful additional photography, which I'd be happy to talk about. But the really interesting thing with this, and maybe we'll get to this when we talk about the box office, is just what audiences want out of a rom-com. So anything that we were trying to do to make it different than the 90s rom-coms, different than the streaming rom-coms, have it stand out, was not appreciated. Audiences really wanted to lean into the classic feel of a romantic comedy and have all the classic setups to get you there with those two characters. And so our biggest hurdle was her really figuring out her character trajectory and making them both really likable in the beginning. Because Glen has a tendency to just squint and smile, and I think people were instantly charmed. And because everyone was drawn to thinking the female of this story is the one we're following, they really did put a little more weight on what Bea was doing and her decisions.
I think now's as good a time as any to talk about the box office because it is remarkable. Last I checked, I think it currently sits at about 170 million. So you have a $25 million rom-com making 170 million worldwide, and it's actually made a little more worldwide than domestic, which for action, sci-fi, horror, it's expected, but unheard of for a rom-com because comedy can be so specific to the nuances of a region or of a language. Do you even consider worldwide audiences when you're vetting the comedy?
I can only speak to our conversations in the cutting room. I don't know in terms of Will's conversations with the Sony and marketing and tracking and all that kind of stuff. But I believe we always sort of addressed it as this is really going to be a US, maybe, definitely Australia, UK kind of a movie, but not as much an international draw because they're not, as you say, big action heroes, very well-known stars. I mean, they're really known at the time in a very small pocket of even the US. I would find that, so I have a 17-year-old and a 21-year-old, and they absolutely know who Sydney Sweeney is. I think my son knew Glen Powell only because of Top Gun Maverick. My daughter did not see it. And I think we found that in our cutting room, I should call out, so Nick Coker is our first assistant, Rachel LaFond was our second assistant, and our PA, Luna Santuala, they were all in that late 20s, early 30s age group. So they all knew Sydney more than they knew Glen. But with tracking and things, I think that the studio was finding that not a lot of other regions knew these guys. So I don't think we ever counted on that international box office, which I think is a testament to romantic comedy and people wanting to feel happy. They want to go out and they want to watch something that just makes them feel pure joy. And when you leave this movie, you're singing a little song as you go out. And that also, I think social media has definitely aided that. But if it was just social media, I feel like that would only be the English language regions, and it's not. So I think it really does speak to people wanting to feel good.
So Tia's worked with Will for a while now. This is your first opportunity really with him, Kim. Your reflections on his style in terms of what he shoots. Does he give you a lot of coverage, a lot of alts? Does he encourage a lot of improv? What was your take on his shooting style?
He does all of that. Lots of angles, lots of cameras, lots of things that are beautifully shot. I think even all of the establishing stuff of Sydney, I think Will he has an eye for the camera, and he has even a great relationship with his actors where he definitely will direct them to the point of getting the read that he wants. I think he's really great with understanding the scenes, which helps Tia and I even put those together even faster. I honestly love his relationship with the actors and being able to get their performances, because I think that, that's where it starts. That's where it makes the movie in the writing. But if you don't have actors and can't get them there, you're not going to have a great movie.
I'm going to quote another editor. I'm not going to use the editor's name because I didn't say, can I use your quote? But the gist of what the editor said was, if I started with the first take, I'd be using early performances, most of which are going to be replaced by better later work. If the best jokes arrive in the last take, it's much faster to start with those. Do you find that you start looking at later takes first and go back from there? Or is it really just a linear thing where let's just look through these take by take?
I will watch everything because I was brought up in the old school film days where you'd sit in a screening room and everybody would watch the dailies on film. I will start by watching all the dailies that I definitely do every day when they come in. Not necessarily, I'm going to watch this scene of dailies and then start cutting. I'm going to watch all of it so that, again, I can write my little report. I can tell anybody, producers, director, anything that they may need for the next day's shoot. And during that time, I'm also making notes as to what I like and what I don't like. With Will, because he doesn't turn the camera off a lot of times, I can hear him directing the actors. And I can see how he's changing. And we sort of established that on Friends with Benefits, where I could listen to where he was taking a scene, because he will change dialogue on the spot or he'll throw alts in there. And I can kind of hear how he's trying to, like, what's bothering him, like what dialogue is not feeling right, or logic or any of that kind of stuff. And that really helps. It does mean that you have to kind of sort through all the down times, which when you've got that much footage, that's not very easy. And then when I'm about to cut a scene, I will basically rewatch the sections that I'm working in again and again of every take of dailies, just to make sure, even if I have in my mind, I know this was my favorite take, I'll just double check. Even if I get like a first pass of the scene, I'll then double check line reads and make sure, like, do I have my favorites in here right now? Because sometimes a line read is great in dailies and way too broad or not broad enough or whatever it is once you actually start cutting and finding the shape of the scene.
Well, I think with this in particular, because I did sit with you in the beginning and because you had kind of told me in between that your last relationship with Will and how he does do that, where he does talk in between takes. So because I was more aware of that, I knew what to look for because of your guidance. And so that made it a lot easier, because if he's having the actor do 6 or 7 line reads in a row and then knowing, probably majority of the last one or the second to last one, like he got it. And that's probably what he would want to use as well. So I think it's looking for those things. And once you know what to look for, it definitely helps.
To add to that point, though, there are, on films that I've worked on, there are actors that are better in like the first, second, third take. And then as the shoot goes on, or sometimes even as the coverage gets closer, it's like they've said the lines so many times that it starts to get a little less genuine. And that's not the norm. Really, the norm is that I find that actors will kind of hold back in the wider shots, and then they really are there and give it, not to say they're not performing the entire time, but you'll get some stronger performances the closer the camera gets. But I think in this case, there wasn't like a definite, even though Will was pushing certain things, certain directions, I think there were moments where I think both Kim and I found that some earlier takes were better for performances, for things, for emotions, for things. Sometimes I think when there was a lot of stop and starts, some of the kind of deeper undercore emotions of the characters get a little lost as they're trying to find the comedy and the rhythm of those particular lines.
Well, Tia, you said 2 things that reminded me of other questions. You mentioned wide shots, and you talked about a performance sort of waning, maybe getting stale as it's being iterated over and over again. I'll start with the last point first. In comedy, with a joke, you hear it the first time and it really lands. But in your roles, you're hearing it 100 times. So over that amount of time, it just doesn't have the same effect. You talked about bringing in the crew a little bit to look at things, but with a comedic beat that you're having to play through over and over again, and you might start to lose faith in it. What do you do? Do you have people you trust that you go to for vetting? Like, is this still funny?
Yeah, definitely. It's the crew. And this particular team, we just all gelled together so well. Like we would, if we had moments to have lunch, we'd all be playing trivia games and Wordle and Framed. And like, we kind of like personalities just really hit it off. So it really helped with this particular crew. I would say a really good example of this was when they go on the hike and it's the spider in the pants scene. But first they're kind of acting out the hand down your pants and, all that kind of stuff. I knew the things that brought me to tears when I was watching dailies. And so I used those. That's certainly my go-to first and foremost. But as I was building the scene, you're right, it got stale to me. And so I was like, I have no idea if this is going to be funny or if this is just boring or if I'm going too far. And so then I brought everybody in and watched them watch the cut and watched them laugh to the point of tears and, all that kind of stuff really early on. And that gave me confidence to go back in and make whatever little adjustments I needed to make. But I wasn't like living in the, oh my God, this is terrible zone, because your brain can do that and it can stop you from moving forward. I mean, I don't know, Kim, if that happens with you as well, but just there are times where I will start to lose confidence in something that I'm cutting. And then I'm like, oh, the whole thing is it's just terrible. Either do I start again? And so at those points, you need to step away and bring other people in and find out if it's working or not.
I've heard that comedy should exist in the wide shots, or it's found in the wide shots. Is that an overgeneralization, or can you actually pinpoint that, yeah, I find that as I'm trying to make a joke land, that more often than not, I'm staying wide for that?
I think it's about physical comedy. So you can, I mean, just logic wise, you miss stuff if you don't see it. So you'd want to go wider if there's a physical something. For me, I think that it is scene dependent. It is just depends on what the comedy is based on. I do a lot of dialogue comedies and, have done physical comedies, Kim and I both, with THUNDERFORCE. And I was on Superintelligence, which has a little more Melissa McCarthy fun physical stuff. But when it becomes this mostly biting banter, early on in this film, they're in a bar and they're just going at each other with banter. So that once we went wide for certain shots, it would deflate. Like you needed them sparring off side by side. And so it really is just depending on what the scene is asking for.
A lot of F-bombs in this movie, a little bit of very quick nudity. This one I could see like, all right, if we really wanted to tone it down, it could have been a PG-13. Any discussions about that, whether to make it a PG-13 or an R?
Initially, there was a lot more nudity. I don't know if this has been spoken to in interviews. It's maybe the very first place, but we had even more nudity at the top of the movie. So this is an interesting movie because of some of the additional photography things that we did just in the process of how to make a movie. Tom Rothman, head of Sony Studios, gave us a note early on to just cover ourselves with certain things so that just in case the nudity didn't work. And thank God he did, because it didn't. It was very interesting and there was more crass language. And I think the original kind of approach that Will wanted to do, and I think also kind of from a marketing standpoint, is let's definitely make this an R-rated comedy, because you've got Sydney Sweeney, whose fan base is going to be Euphoria. So these are people who aren't going to live in the fairy tale twinkly space as much. But even just wanting to live in adult space, maybe Will's, and I'm speaking completely for him from my own head, but, living in Peter Rabbit for 2 films back to back, I think he was wanting to go back into some adult stuff. Anyhow, when we screened again and again for our friends and family and then bigger audiences, people were so turned off by anything too sexual. And we ended up with a very, I think, elegant sex scene. And yes, F-bombs, but that couldn't be helped. That was already baked in. And I think it really did kind of help us box office wise with the R rating, because I think that the younger people, it made it like, oh, it's taboo. I really want to see it. I know a good friend of mine who has, I believe, 12 or 13-year-old daughters. They wanted to go so badly, and she had to hold back on it for a while, and then ultimately went and took her daughters to see it, but after she had already seen it.
Because there are such a handful of scenes that use like nudity for comedy. So I feel like if this was a PG-13 movie, like those scenes wouldn't have worked as well, if at all, because, those are the scenes that you're sitting in the audience and they're just laughing. They're laughing out loud. They're enjoying their time. They're enjoying that. And it's really funny. It really is.
I asked Kim, what did you think of Will's shooting style? And I gave you a bunch of examples and you're like, yeah, all the above. Having all that footage and the different alternates and things like that, are there any tricks or techniques for managing media and managing story that you do, whether it's how you organize the bins or color coding in the timeline or how you do your versions? What do you do to try and tame that chaos?
Tia and I guess, are very, very organized people in general. So I think not having too many dailies in the bins, having it kind of organized, either it's by story or by particular beats. I think for this, it wasn't necessarily the amount or the size of the bins, because these were just long takes. So, your average take would be 11 to 15 minutes. So Tia and I would have our lovely assistants, put markers for resets, and script sync definitely helped with the organization of everything, because, when we're sitting with Will, he wants to reassess and look at every line read. So instead of being able to click on each individual clip and try and find exactly where that line is, script sync really did help, because we could just get through stuff so quickly and, color 2 or 3 takes that Will liked and then play them again, and then, narrow it down to that one and just swap it out. So that saved a lot of time with that particular organization.
It's true. It's in takes that are that long, sometimes you get lost in them. It's hard to find the pieces that you like. And when you do, some people will pull and make sort of a line read sequence or something like that. But I don't love doing that because I find that if I only focus on just those lines, I'm losing what the human faces are doing kind of around there. Like, I actually find some of my best pieces when I'm scrolling through those huge takes looking for whatever the best line read is going to be. I'll see, oh, there's this facial expression that I didn't clock before. But definitely our team helped keep us sane because there is a lot of footage.
Well, needle drops are an important component to most films, not always, and I don't always ask about them. But with rom-coms, they certainly seem to be an important component. One is actually sort of written into the story here. Before we get into that song, tell me about the needle drop process. Does Will have a playlist that he gives to you? Is it something you work through with a music supervisor? How do you get to the songs that make up Anyone But You?
Well, I'll speak to the history of music and Will. So our music supervisor, Wendy Crowley, has been working with Will since his half-hour comedy days. So she usually is brought into the process even long before I'm brought into the process with scripts and things, because she'll help get licensing for, songs that are being written into the movie. And then she sends playlists of like general vibe. This is what I'm feeling for this scene, or this is what I'm feeling for the overall tone of the movie. And then he will listen to things, but not really focus as much unless it has to be playback music. He won't focus as much on those songs during production. And yet he kind of can't watch scenes without the perfect song. So we spend a lot of time, and I'm talking full days, not editing, but looking for the perfect song. So then Will has also worked with our music editor, Sherry Whitfield, ever since his first movie, Fired Up. And so she also knows the process. And so Wendy and Sherry, usually Wendy, Sherry, and myself, now Kim, and even the rest of our crew, like we would all pull together music that we liked, that we thought would be good. As you can tell by watching the movie, it's nonstop music, nonstop. And then in the middle of the process here, like Will does not love score. He wants everything to sound like a song, even if it's going to be score. So we were very lucky to get Esty Heim and her composing partner. They really found the sound of the movie that made it sound like they were needle drops as well, which was great.
As I said, there is one specific song unwritten by Natasha Bedingfield, and it's featured prominently in the film. You said you walk away singing a song. Well, it's because in the credits, you have the cast in various scenes singing bits of the song. Tell me about putting together an end credit song compilation.
Yeah, it was definitely having the song laid out, and then as soon as we got like the bits, just going through and seeing what worked and what were the funnier parts of it. And also just keeping it alive and not feeling like it was repetitive. So I think it was just figuring out all of the different pieces that Will was able to get. But then also, it was actually Will's idea to take, there's like a little part where it stops down and then the brides kind of reveal that they were behind faking their fight the entire time. And so we really liked putting that in the middle just to kind of break up but kind of continue the story, because it felt like they didn't have their ending from that, like, because you're setting this whole bit up between them of, oh my gosh, were they not going to get married? Were they really fighting? And so it's kind of fun to know that Glen and Sydney were kind of the pawns, like, still the entire time. It was definitely kind of going back and forth, a lot of testing, a lot of swapping, a lot of figuring out what really worked, but it was a lot of fun to put together.
If I haven't implied it or outright said it, I think rom-coms are deceptively difficult to do. And therefore, I have a lot more questions I could ask you. I know that you're both busy, and if you're not busy, you must be tired after all that work. I can't let you go without closing out on one of my obnoxious questions. The male lead in the film, Ben, going back to that unwritten by Natasha Bedingfield, it's his Serenity song. When he's flying and he's not a good flyer, he listens to Unwritten to calm him down. For each of you, when things get chaotic in the editing room, what do you do to find some kind of serenity?
It's such a good question. I don't think I've mastered it yet.
Well, we used to go on walks. We used to go on walks when we were on the Sony lot, which helped.
That definitely helped. Going and, just kind of taking a lap and talking out what our approach was going to be definitely helped. We didn't do it as much once we got to West Hollywood. I think just checking in with each other, I think, was really kind of the Kim keeps me sane, which I'm thankful for every day. In our cutting room, the way it was structured, we were kind of just in a little like main kitchen-y space, and our cutting rooms were just all bordering that, but we could leave our doors open, and because of the lovely acoustics of the space, like you can basically hear everything. So I would, maybe be having a tense moment in the cutting room, and then I would come in and check with Kim and be like, did you hear that? Did I sound like an asshole? What? That sort of thing. I think, we would just keep checking in with each other. I knew like if I could hear the dynamic going on in her room and they were really struggling to find something, and if Will left the room to make a phone call or something like that, then I would check in with her and, how's it going? Let me know if you need me to step in or take a look at anything. We would just do that for each other. And I think that definitely helps. No Serenity songs.
If you haven't mastered Serenity in the cutting room yet, don't worry. That's what sequels are for.
That is very, very true.
What do you think? Do you think a studio that made over $200 million off a movie with a $25 million budget would consider doing a sequel? I think you can bank on that, but we'll see. For now, please join me in thanking Tia and Kim for taking a little time to explore the world of editing rom-coms with us. A great education and a very nice change of pace where nobody had to die. Except that spider Kim crushed. Before we say goodbye for today, do not forget that there is this amazing thing called Avid Media Composer that can help you on your journey to being a more complete editor. Maybe you're only half an editor right now, 2/3 at best. Well, learning Media Composer can maximize your skills and increase your job opportunities. You can check it all out by clicking that link in the show notes, and it will instantly teleport you over to the Media Composer page on avid.com. Okay, big weekend, Oscars weekend. Don't forget to keep an eye out for that IAVA panel hosted by Ace and Avid. Lots to learn there. And still lots to learn here too. So won't you please come back again so it's not just me talking to myself, like it is right now. Anyway, and as always, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.